and welcome to Plenary 3. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that we know a few people didn't have the CU quiz pop up for them as expected. And if that was the case for you, please message the admin so we can manually check you in. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Christina and Aarin, who will give talks regarding two related topics during the next hour. I will introduce both speakers right now, but we'll hear from Christina first and have Q&A session afterwards. And at around 2:20 Pacific time, we will hear from Aarin. And Christina's talk topic is fostering inclusive excellence in genetic counseling graduate program admissions. Christina Palmer, PhD, MS, is from UCLA. Christina Palmer is a professor at UCLA in the Departments of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, Human Genetics, and Institute of Society and Genetics. She is also the program director of the UCLA Genetic Counseling Graduate Program. She brings to this topic her decades of experience in the genetic counseling profession and in higher education, as well as her commitment to advancing inclusive excellence in the genetic counseling profession. And fun fact, she discovered in 2020 that working in sweatpants is not so bad. Now turning it over to Christina.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm so pleased to be presenting today. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a cisgender white female. Today I am going to be talking about a rather complicated topic, super important, and it's complicated because there are so many connections. Everything is connected. And so even though I'll be kind of parsing things into pieces, everything is really relating to each other. I do not have any financial relationships to disclose. The learning objectives for my presentation have to do with being able to list 3 best practices in holistic admissions, and so I'll be talking about holistic admissions, and to describe 2 recruitment strategies for advancing inclusive excellence in admissions. I'm going to just start briefly by motivating this topic, which I think everybody is already motivated by. When we look at, in this right-hand column, the most recent NSGC professional status survey statistics about genetic counselors in North America, that it is predominantly a white female profession. And those statistics are not similar to either the 2019 United States demographics or even California's demographics. And so the profession has been highly skewed in a direction that is really not healthy for the workforce and for patient care ultimately. And so when we think about how to increase the diversity of the workforce, it will go all the way back to how do people learn about genetic counseling as a career, what motivates somebody to apply to a genetic counseling master's program, wanting to pursue that profession, what is that application process like, what is the admissions process like, how do they ultimately get into a program, and then beyond. And today's conference has been touching on so many important topics that all relate to the field of genetic counseling and the importance of increasing the diversity of the workforce. So here, like I said, I want to break things down into steps, even though everything is very interrelated. And the steps that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to actually first talk about kind of the point at which somebody is applying, and then I'll talk about the application review process, the interview process, the match process, because that is a relevant piece of the equation in terms of going to genetic counseling graduate programs. And then I'm going to loop back and talk about recruitment, because of course, recruitment is so important because it's driving the step into who is applying to genetic counseling graduate programs. I'm also in this presentation, I've taken a tack of really trying to identify areas in which actions can be taken and what kinds of constituents might be tasked with taking those actions. When the program committee first approached me about the possibility of presenting on this topic, they really highlighted that they wanted actions. And so that's how I'm approaching this topic today. So first I want to talk about just applying to genetic counseling graduate programs. And everything that I'm going to be talking about is through the eye of fostering inclusive excellence. So in this table then I have it by, let's think about what are some of the big questions to ask. Who are these questions relevant to? That's the audience. And then the actions that could be taken. And many of the actions that I am proposing, there's literature, evidence-based, supporting these actions coming from the genetic counseling literature and other literature relevant to healthcare professions or higher education in general. So the first question is, who's applying? Okay, so that's that, and so that's relevant to the potential applicants. And this is really going to loop back to recruitment, and so I'll talk about it a little bit here and then in more detail towards the end. But the actions to be taken here really, I think, are an important thing for genetic counselors and genetic counseling students to participate in the pipeline building of who is applying to genetic counseling graduate programs. And as we know from the literature, you need to begin planting career path seeds early in a person's educational trajectory. And we also know that high school guidance counselors are not inclined to promote genetic counseling as a career path for a variety of reasons, including just lack of awareness. We know that identifying and trying to promote the genetic counseling in high school level, community colleges, pre-health student groups can have some positive effects. Okay, so we'll talk about that again a little bit later. Here's another, I think, important question that the audiences, the potential applicants, like, why are they choosing that particular institution to apply to? Is it, and the things that I think are relevant when we're thinking about fostering inclusive excellence and there's evidence to back it up, is that individuals are probably looking at who's the program faculty. Is it a diverse program faculty? Is it a diverse student body? Is it a diverse patient population? There was a recent article published in the Journal of Genetic Counseling where some of the data that came out indicated that that one of the aspects that was important for individuals in underrepresented groups and thinking about entering genetic counseling as a profession was trying to increase access to genetic services. So looking at, how diverse is that patient population? What's the curriculum look like? Is it an inclusive curriculum? Is there financial assistance available to help defray costs of higher education? There's evidence from studies that plays a role, the financial aspects. So when thinking about actions to take, I think about what can genetic counselors do? And I'm, maybe self-serving here, but I think increased involvement in genetic counseling programs in terms of giving lectures, clinical supervision, advisory board membership, committee membership, capstone thesis membership, mentoring. We heard earlier today the importance of mentoring. And this is all because when you think about genetic counselors in Southern California in particular, I think that we're in a stronger, we have more diversity in Southern California to the benefit of our area. And so that's a mechanism for showing diversity in access to mentors and people involved in the programs. I think about genetic counselors also when we think about the diversity of the patient population question. If applicants are looking at that, thinking about working with employers to increase access to genetic counseling services, increase the diversity of the patient population. Programs on their level can be focusing on recruiting and mentoring diverse program faculty for education leadership positions. There's just a boom of education leadership position openings, and there will continue to be forever more now as with the increasing number of genetic counseling programs. Programs can address their curriculum, as we heard earlier from one of the KGI students, Kayla, addressing a curriculum for inclusive language, non-gendered language. And I think programs can do a better job, and probably are these days, of providing this kind of information on program websites, highlighting the diversity of their program, faculty and students, the patient populations, what's their curriculum, really putting a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion right out there on their program websites. And then programs and institutions could provide financial assistance information on program institutions and their websites and during the interviews. How do applicants apply? Okay, so that's actually turning out, I think, to be an interesting question. And we're piloting at UCLA application workshops, and we're going to be measuring outcomes to see what kind of role that might play in fostering inclusive excellence in the application pool. What about the admission requirements? There's a lot of discussion now about admission requirements, and I think that for programs, they can review their application requirements to ensure that they actually have a very specific purpose, that there's really a reason for that being a requirement, and considering eliminating unnecessary or potential barrier requirements. We saw in this last year, because of the pandemic, that many institutions waived the GREs. They made GREs optional as opposed to a requirement. And I think that made a difference in the number of applications last year. And so I think there will be programs reconsidering if GREs are a necessary requirement. And then application fees. Almost all institutions or programs charge an application fee. And so institutions and programs could determine if there are circumstances to grant fee waivers and provide that information on program and institution websites. Then when I think about genetic counseling groups, such as the SCGC or NSGC or whatever, I think there's potential role to determine if there are mechanisms to create financial assistance or scholarships, if they could be set up through these organizations. Oops. Okay, so the next step then, we have applicants who have applied. So the next step is the application review process. And there's a lot of elements to application review, especially if you're really taking inclusive excellence quite seriously. So one question to ask is, who's on the admissions committee? And that's the audience to be, asking that question is the program leadership and the committee itself. And so for programs, they should constitute committees that represent diverse perspectives and experiences. And as you'll see, this is one of the best practices with holistic review, which I'll talk about in a second. And from genetic counselors, what kinds of actions they could take is accept invitations to participate on genetic counseling program admissions committees or interviews. Having a larger number of people involved in the process can be a healthy thing. What are the roles and responsibilities of the admissions committee? That's the committee needs to take a good hard look at what their roles and responsibilities are. And they can develop a charter that defines those roles and responsibilities. They could have a term limit. They could have a method for identifying new members. And they can have admissions review philosophy and practices laid out. What about trainings for the admissions committee? So in that regard, of course, there should be FERPA training because educational information does have some privacy attached to it, just as if, just like we have HIPAA for medical personal health information. And another important aspect is for committee members to take implicit bias training, to be made aware of implicit bias so that there can be actions to mitigate bias. Then there's the review process itself, the application review process. And I want to talk about holistic review and the best practices for holistic review. So the holistic review could be described as a review that places value on students' life experiences, cultural backgrounds, and the characteristics that define a qualified applicant. That's different from a review that is only looking at GPA or only looking at GRE, only looking at sort of metric information. A holistic review considers that and more, okay? It's a method, and so if we think about it in terms of a method, it's a method in which the reviewers consider all available information in order to get the fullest picture of everything that an applicant can bring to the program. And here are some best practices. It's not an exhaustive list, but the first thing is it's really about assessing, like I said, many aspects of an individual, not just cognitive variables or metrics like GPA or GRE, but non-cognitive variables, which could fall into thinking about experiences in the healthcare setting, experiences with teaching, leadership experiences or skills, interpersonal skills, creativity, problem solving, contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion, etc. So there are many other types of experiences or attributes that one could evaluate for candidates. And in one paper written by Davis et al., which is a very nice paper, they really sort of categorize these different types of variables in terms of 3 categories: experiences, attributes, and metrics. And they advocate for evaluation on all 3 of these categories. As I mentioned, a best practice is having diverse admissions committees. And the admissions committee can define diversity, in a variety of ways. But the most important thing is that, it's just not stacked with people who all think the same. Another aspect is to separate the steps. So you have the applications. So one group could be performing that initial screening. And then from that step, then there's a group that are invited for interviews. Another group could perform the interviews, or you could add to the screening group other individuals that are participating in the interview phase. And then you combine these assessments for a final decision. And along the lines with any of these, whether it's the application review phase or the interview phase or the combination phase, is to create a priori rubrics for how those applicants are going to be evaluated. And this takes thought. It takes intention to develop a rubric. It takes defining what are the characteristics that define a qualified genetic counseling applicant. And once the committee is satisfied with their rubric, then they can implement it. And then it prompts the reviewers to use that approach, the same approach to evaluating all applicants. So that helps to mitigate implicit bias by having this objective approach. The advantages of a holistic review is that it's holistic. You can evaluate fit. You can match it, you can think about the mission and vision and goals of the program, the institution, evaluate candidates and, along those lines. You can also evaluate potential for things. It doesn't have to always just be what did you do yesterday, but potential, future potential, soft skills, what they're talking about, non-cognitive attributes. It really is the broader picture. And there is evidence to demonstrate that holistic review can increase the diversity of ultimately of the class that is enrolled. So when I go back to this table, I highlighted in red because I think this is really the nut. That's the most important thing in the whole web of inclusive excellence, fostering inclusive excellence. Remember, with that rubric and defining, what it is, what are the qualities we're looking for, I think that as a profession at large, it really is about examining our assumptions and values about what are the qualities that make a good genetic counselor. And because our collective values are rippling through the entire admissions process and growth of the profession. And so I think that's a big conversation. It's a very healthy conversation that we have to have through the entire profession. The other aspect here is that when if we could have a collective set of values that then could be assessed through the admissions process, then it's easier to develop opportunities for applicants to develop and demonstrate those skills that are reflective of the profession's collective values. And then so that's I think the biggest thing. From a program or committee point of view, just as I said, you really want to determine your criteria ahead of time. I think ideally you're actually requesting information that the applicants can provide as part of the admissions process, that you're letting them know on the website, these are the types of things that you should be demonstrating, so that they then can tell you how they've demonstrated, so that they can be evaluated on it. And I also think that it will be important, of course, to have a COI policy in place. From the program and committee perspective as well, I think it has been demonstrated, certainly within the UC system, to require all applicants to submit a DEI statement, not just applicants applying for a DEI scholarship, because that just demonstrates, by requiring all participants to submit a DEI statement, that is a value of the institution and of the program. And then, as I mentioned, programs can ensure that their website has all the appropriate information. And from the applicant, I think their responsibility can be to engage in activities that contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Christina, just wanted to give you a time reminder. We have about 7 minutes before we'll move on to Aaron's talk.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me now move to the interview. And in terms of fostering inclusive excellence, where are those interviews going to be conducted? Historically, they were always in person. I think you might all remember that, and traveling to multiple institutions. And that's actually fairly costly to do that and have the resources to be able to do that. And then during the pandemic, everything became virtual. And I think that there was some learning that one could conduct interviews virtually. And so the suggestion here is for programs to really just use one mode of interview, whether it's going to be virtual or in person, but just to use one mode, so that it's all the same for all of the candidates. And if they had the opportunity to evaluate and compare virtual to in person to see if it made a difference. And if not, then that helps to select one or over the other, and at least have that information in play. What does it cost to interview? So in thinking about financial assistance to help defray cost of in-person interviews, and again, if it didn't make a difference for the virtual, perhaps the virtual way it will be obviously less expensive. And for GC groups, they could determine if are there mechanisms to offer financial assistance or scholarship to prospective candidates. You have to think about how candidates can see the program, can see the institution, can see the area. And so I think we're all going to start being a little more creative about that, and creating video tours, because if it's important for candidates to be able to visualize, how diverse is that area, how diverse is that program faculty, how diverse is the patient population. I think that there are many ways to highlight that. And I think it would be so fabulous to highlight Southern California. And I think about a few things that SCGC might consider in the future, developing materials that welcome candidates to Southern California, highlighting its efforts to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, highlight student mentoring possibilities, highlight that the diversity of the membership equals diversity in clinical supervisors and mentors. I think that would be very important information for candidates. And then the programs could share SCGC materials to candidates. Okay, I'm going to move on here. I'm going to touch quickly on the match. So the match process, what is the purpose of the match process? It is really to use applicants' preferences and program preferences in an algorithm to determine program placement, and in some cases to determine types of financial assistance that a student would receive from a program. So that's what the match does. And so all applicants must register for the match, and they must, learn a little bit about what that is all about. And the aspect about registering for the match is that the programs really need to highlight that that's a requirement, is to register for the match. And then that costs money. It costs $100 and it's non-refundable. Now they only pay once, and then they can apply to however many programs they want to apply. They don't have to re-register for the match for every program. But $100 still may be a lot of money for some students, or for some potential students. AGCPD, the Association for Genetic Counseling Program Directors, does offer a limited number of fee waivers based on financial need. And they have some criteria for that. And that information has now come out. And so programs can update their program websites with this information about a match fee waiver application. And I think that that's something that groups like SCGC maybe could advertise the match fee waiver, AGCP's PD's match fee waiver, to, again, just to get the word out that this exists. Okay, so now let's loop back around to recruitment strategies. So these are my dreams and potential ideas for things that SCGC might consider, and perhaps is already considering. One area is developing initiatives for pipeline building. We talked about how important it is for potential genetic counselors to learn about the genetic counseling field, and they're not learning about it from their guidance counselors, their academic counselors, and so they're going to have to learn about it in other ways. One idea is to develop relationships with faculty or teachers, and to give presentations in high school classrooms or community colleges. Although, sometimes there's mixed evidence on how effective that is, but trying to raise awareness, because some of the research shows that it's not that students who are underrepresented have less interest in the career. What they have is less awareness of the career. And once they learn about the career, the interest is about, is the same. They have the same level of interest as non-minority individuals. So focusing on Cal State's community colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and historically Black and colleges and universities could be areas to explore, or schools that serve traditionally under-resourced or underrepresented communities. And again, to develop relationships with faculty instead of academic counselors, I think will probably be a little more effective. I wanted to highlight an example here on the right, that Erica Price, who is a fairly recent genetic counseling graduate student, and who has published some work here that I'm citing. She's launched an initiative, Genetics Opportunities Learning and Development Empowerment Network, Golden, which is an initiative to cultivate interest in genetic counseling among prospective Black or African American students. So she may have some very valuable insight or experience to share in that regard. I think career workshops are also potentially viable. At UCLA, I just want to highlight that there's a genetic counseling student interest group there, and over the years have had this annual genetic counseling career workshop. And these are data from 2019, some demographic information collected on 52 individuals who responded. I think there were more present, but 52 people responded to the survey. And you can see that it does a pretty good job, I mean, at least in this data, of having a fairly diverse attendees, which is very promising in terms of, just mechanisms for reaching a wide audience about the genetic counseling career. I think application assistance is another area that SCGC could consider. Developing CV workshops helped applicants discover the meaning of their activities and how they relate to a genetic counseling skill set. Not everybody is going to be able to shadow a genetic counselor, but many people have relevant experience and they don't necessarily recognize that. Another thing that could, I think, be potentially valuable, and this came out of some work here by Alvarado Wing, to develop mock interview workshops, help applicants practice answering interview questions. Again, financial assistance, if that's something that SCGC is in a position to consider, I think that might be a nice contribution. And I do believe promoting the diversity of Southern California is a very important thing to do. And I think that I just think that's an area I would put a lot of energy into.
Thanks, Christina. We are going to have to end the time here since we need to get over into Aaron's section, but just as a reminder, people can download slides after the talk as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Christina, you can look at the Q&A and answer them. We appreciate that. Okay, so next I'd like to introduce Aarin Williams, MS, and to end her talk on genetic counselors in the DEI space, courage in practice. Aarin is the clinical genetic counselor at Kaiser Permanente in the Tri-Central South Bay service area. She has presented DEI education on Black Americans for the Stanford University GC Professional Development Seminar and has facilitated learning for aspiring healthcare providers at Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science, California's only historically Black college. She is a member of the National Society of Genetic Counselors JEDI Committee and has provided genetics education for California Department of Public Health Sickle Cell Counselor Training Program. Fun fact, she was gifted a Cricut cutting machine as an engagement gift, and she has made corny personalized shirts for her family for every holiday for the last 4 years, purely for her own entertainment. Now turning it over to Aarin.
Great, thank you so much, Pink. Let me share my screen. Okay, perfect. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am by no means a DEI expert, but I am someone who's passionate about learning more and just doing and being better. So I'd really like to spend the time that I have with you highlighting for you the ways that you may already be doing equity work, and then provide you with some helpful tools to expand on what you're already doing. So maybe you aren't the militant person calling out every injustice that you see, but we all have a role in this work towards forward progress. I also have to say that I do not have all the answers. So I'm hoping that we can use the time at the conclusion of this presentation to hear from other colleagues who might be willing to share what they've added to their own personal equity toolkits. I want to acknowledge my own bias in how I created this session. My own lived experience is obviously going to shape my worldview. And it's so easy to get caught up in the things that define us and almost have blinders on to all of the other ways that people are existing in ways that are really different from us. And luckily for this presentation, I didn't have to recreate the wheel. Many of these slides came from my personal notes from other DEI-focused talks that are available through the National Society of Genetic Counselors and other helpful web pages. I've included some links for those of you interested toward the end, and since the slides are downloadable, they'll be there for you as well. And from the great minds of my fellow Black genetic counselor colleague friends and the NSGC JEDI committee. So for some, this topic is uncomfortable, and for others, it might not be a priority. So I thank you in advance for your time and your attention, and I just ask that we come into this segment with open minds and open hearts. So I don't have any financial disclosures, but I'd like to start with a quick acknowledgement that I'm giving this session on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, and give my respect to them as the land caretakers of the LA Basin. And I'd like to thank all ancestors and relatives, past, present, and emerging, that brought us to this space to share this time together. So my objectives for this presentation are short and sweet, despite the complexity of the topic. I'd like to first acknowledge the barriers to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within our profession, reflect on the ways our personal identities will interfere with the provision of genetic counseling services, and then talk about ways that we can utilize genetic counseling tools as transferable skills in DEI work. So through this session, I'm hoping you come away with some concrete ways to use the skills that you already have as trained genetic counselors, students, and genetics professionals to really help us move that needle forward. One of the powerful things about being a genetic counselor is that we're trained to provide information to patients that can sometimes be ambiguous or unclear or uncomfortable in ways that are tangible and digestible. We focus on autonomy. We talk about embracing differences that make people unique. We always advocate for our patients to feel seen and heard. And believe it or not, folks, these are the makings of a DEI warrior. So we're literally the superstars of courageous conversations. We cold call patients with confusing details about test results. We walk into rooms to be the bearer of that news, but we also hold hands through difficult diagnoses and put our own feelings aside to be present for people every day. So we're made for this. Let's get it done. Those who know me in my personal life know that I'm a chronic self-help book buyer and a lover of a good quote. So I'll be sprinkling in a few jewels, all from the brilliant Brene Brown on courage. But for the Name It section, our quote is, "Integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them." So in order for us to really get to the Name It section of our objectives, I need to start with a few necessary definitions because it's important for you to know how I'm defining these terms throughout the presentation. I'm sure that many of you have seen these images by Tony Ruth at Lunch Breath and are familiar with what they're describing, but for those who are not, the first picture here is one that demonstrates inequality or unequal access. We see that fruit is falling toward one side of the tree and not the other. The next one, equality, question mark, shows that the tools for assistance here are evenly distributed because equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same thing in order to enjoy full, healthy lives, right? But in a broken system, or in this case, a crooked tree, and giving the same thing to everyone doesn't do much to solve the problem. I think in this third picture here, the concept of equity to me is closer to the concept of fairness, because when things are equitable, we're seeking to identify and understand those the avoidable and unfair differences that really put things at a disadvantage and then put measures in place to address them. And justice here, I think in this fourth picture, is a way to make equity sustainable. If we fix the root cause of the problem, so in this case, straighten up that tree, and then offer tools and opportunities to allow everyone to flourish, then that's the real way to make progress. And when I say name it, here's our first perhaps uncomfortable lesson. I'm trying to really push myself to actually name the diversity that I'm speaking about. Diversity right now is a trendy catch-all, but really, what are you talking about when you say it? Diversity describes differences people have with respect to race, ethnicity, religion, color, gender identity or expression, disability status, sexual orientation, age, education, among others. This certainly isn't an exhaustive list. But I think even naming racial diversity when talking about race helps to orient the topic and make it seem less like a buzzword. We're also going to be talking a lot about bias. So explicit bias is overt. It's processed at a conscious level, but implicit bias is sneakier. This is our unconscious attitude and belief system. And implicit bias can be in direct contradiction to a person's espoused beliefs and values. Studies show that those whose conscious values are rooted in equity, equality, and justice, dare I say, the well-meaning altruistic healthcare professional, may actually be more prone to unacknowledged implicit bias. Implicit bias and the inability to name it can interfere with clinical assessment, decision-making, and really the kinds of relationships that we have with our patients. And lastly, microaggressions. So microaggression is a term that was coined to describe the everyday verbal or behavioral indignity. These don't have to be big actions. They can also be small little jabs that are taken at others, maybe even at the subconscious level by the aggressor. So I imagine that some of us on this call could be familiar with the sting of, but where are you really from? Or, but you speak so well for insert anything not mainstream. There's usually no guesswork in determining if you're a victim of a microassault. An example of a microassault would be when someone shouts a derogatory slur at a person who's walking down the street. A micro insult might be a little more subtle, kind of backhanded, and it can be hard to tell if the perpetrator is even aware that what they're doing is insulting. For example, when a neurotypical person says they did something like a maniac. And a micro invalidation is more insidious. This would be like this all-white male executive board isn't discriminating against anyone. The best qualified person was offered this position regardless of their background. It's the kind of action that almost makes you question the experience itself. Another example might be telling someone about a microaggression that you experienced and then having them tell you that you're reading into it too much or being oversensitive. And so if we transition all that background knowledge into how we kind of intersect with it, we all know these statistics, I imagine, and if you don't, then I encourage you to take a moment to educate yourselves on disparities in healthcare. There are plenty of reasons why healthcare disparities exist. The Institute of Medicine's report described here concluded that even when access to care barriers like insurance or family income were controlled for, racial and ethnic minorities received worse healthcare than non-minorities, and that both explicit and implicit bias played potential roles. This idea is met with some opposition, though, because bias isn't a comfortable topic and can be emotionally charged, and some may be holding on tight to that image of equality versus equity, maybe not accepting that health disparities are real. But implicit bias can't be addressed if it's not brought into conscious awareness and acknowledged. So choosing not to address bias really dilutes the truth of our current reality. These are some of the barriers I think are present in our workforce that have a direct impact on how GCs might perceive and act upon DEI initiatives. It could be so easy for our fear of saying the wrong thing or having our motives be misinterpreted be the reason why we don't stand up when we see things that we know aren't right, or why we don't take the extra step to name an injustice. We might have concerns about not knowing everything, so therefore we don't say anything out of fear of it not coming out perfectly. And in the same vein, not wanting to make others uncomfortable, step on toes, or offend in what many call our GC culture of nice can be a huge deterrent to growth too. Some are resistant to change because what's happening right now is working for them. Others are literally just tired of hearing about DEI buzzwords in general. And others, particularly those who have hiring power, or as was mentioned in Christina's presentation, program admittance power, could be conflating diversity with inclusion. You know, checking those diversity boxes and having people of different groups in your space doesn't at all mean that you've cultivated an environment for them to be successful, feel safe, and be valued. So having diversity is just the beginning. Ask yourself, what's being done to ensure that everyone feels a sense of inclusion and belonging? So heavy stuff, yes. But now that we've got a good vocabulary going, let's think about how these barriers might play a role in our day-to-day. So we're going to transition to own it and reflect on the ways that our personal identities interfere with the provision of our genetic counseling care. My quote for this is, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. And our implicit bias is going to shape how our personal identities interact with the concepts of power and oppression. The term intersectionality, you may be familiar with, was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, and it's what she defines as the lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. So this is the acknowledgement that everyone has their unique experience with discrimination, and we have to really consider the ways that people can be marginalized. And if you took the time to add your own identities to this, the factors that might shape your views could be how you were raised, what you know to be true based on your experiences, your belief system, your values, your faith traditions, your family structure, you know, what your culture tells you about yourself, or those who have different identities, what society tells you about each of these things. That all plays a role in how we view ourselves and how we view others, which I think is a really good segue to this new thing I learned about. So I learned about this notion by Rudine Sims Bishop and was excited to see the concept taken into the GC context by another presenter, Dr. Liza Toulousan. But this phrase, mirrors and windows, was initially introduced as an education model as a means to understand that an individual can't truly learn about themselves unless they learn about others as well. So a mirror is a story that reflects on your own culture and helps you kind of build your own identity. A window is a resource that offers you a view into someone else's experience. And a sliding glass door is the channel by which you connect the two. So let's take a deep breath and settle in for some self-reflection, very briefly, just because of time constraints. We have a short time together, so I'm going to ask that you close your eyes if you're able and you're not using the captioning option. And as I read the following questions, think about your truth as you answer in your head. I chose not to make these poll questions because your truth is your personal journey. So I'll start reading. Have I ever noticed that I'm less comfortable with patients who identify differently than me? Do I spend less time with those patients than others? Does my capacity to feel and express empathy toward them change? Do I change the way I ask questions about family history when working with patients of a specific racial or ethnic group? Have I made assumptions about a patient's family dynamic when limited information was known about one side of their family? Have I had preconceived notions about a patient's decision-making process because of the way they looked? Have I considered some patients to be angry or frustrated and others worried or concerned when expressing similar emotions to me? And if so, why do you think that is? People are influenced to act based on their beliefs, and their beliefs shape how they see the world, including their perceptions of other people. So in the broader workplace setting, do you know whether your colleagues think that your attitudes and behaviors demonstrate bias? Have patients or their families, either directly or through satisfaction surveys, ever had a negative comment or a perception about your attitude toward them? And then in the same vein as some of the amazing presentations that we've had earlier, the mentoring presentation earlier, and Christina touched on this as well, in the mentorship or leadership setting. Do you seek mentoring relationships with people who don't share your identity? Unconsciously, people are more likely to be invested in someone else's career development when they can see themselves in that colleague. But when you consciously believe that people of an out-group are less skilled, less qualified, or less talented, then you consciously look for affirmation of those beliefs. So have you ever prejudged someone and sought to affirm that belief by using assumptions? Okay, so that might have left you feeling a little yuck. So let's think about ways that we can fix this. My quote for the fix it is, requiring accountability while also extending compassion is not the easiest course of action, but it's the most human and ultimately the safest for the community. Okay, so back to what we know. Consider, again, what makes you a great genetic counselor? Is it your empathy, your non-judgmental approach, your ability to be culturally responsive, the authenticity that you bring, your natural ability to connect and build rapport, your attention to detail, your desire for learning new things? Is it your ability to cultivate trust, your sincerity? My bias on this list is that this is really heavily focused on clinical skills. That's just because that's what I'm doing every day. But again, this isn't an exhaustive list. You know what makes you awesome at your job. So let's turn that reflection into action. So what can you do? Listen, acknowledge and accept the existence of bias, be open to feedback, and reflect on how bias impacts relationships with patients and families in the workplace. Speak up. Use your privilege, combat bias when you see it, and approach recipients of microaggressions to ask how you can help. Get involved by stepping out of your comfort zone, humanize and normalize the differences in others, and diversify your network. And educate yourself. Commit to learning more about combating injustice. Participate in professional development. Advocate for content on equity within your organizations and groups, not just NSGC or SCGC, but even the organizations that you're a part of in the workplace. And embrace discomfort. Sit with that, welcome it as an opportunity to grow, accept individual responsibility, and apologize and call yourself out when you're the perpetrator. Lastly, stay engaged. Develop the habit of really thinking about and confronting bias in your everyday life, and look for solutions to kind of circumvent the hardwired biases that you have. So that's a big ask, certainly easier said than done. But here's an example about how to put this into real-world context. We can use communication tools to use our voice in ways that are empowering, clarifying, and rooted in the values of compassion and growth. And if that doesn't say genetic counselor, then I don't know what does. But these strategies are just a few in a great session on addressing implicit bias. The example that I'll give you guys to kind of flesh out of it is the open the front door method. So you observe, think, feel, and desire. An example of this could be you're in a meeting, you're noticing that the same people are speaking, and they might be speaking about a contentious topic that perhaps not everyone agrees with. One way that you could bring a communication style into kind of naming and intervening would be to first observe. I'm noticing that not everyone who has their hand raised is getting the chance to speak. and then think. I think it's important to hear all voices while we consider the implications of this decision. I feel uncomfortable moving forward. And desire, is it possible that we could create a system that ensures that all voices are heard? And so if you're motivated to act, then these are two concepts I encourage you to learn more about so that you can create opportunities for some everyday activism. We all have personal spheres of influence at home, with our family and friends, in the workplace, with our coworkers, and with our community at large. So these are places where we can really encourage positive behavioral change. Choose to be courageous and challenge privilege. Micro-resistance and tempered radicalism are ways of responding to negative circumstances in a measured, constructive, and thoughtful way that leads to improving a situation. So again, this has genetic counselor written all over it. But when we micro-resist against the everyday forms of oppression that appear in our own spaces, we can work toward creating more inclusive spaces in real life. So here are a few helpful hyperlinks that I think can really help with your personal growth on the topics of bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Please take a look at them in the download if you're interested. And if not, then if you can't access them, or if they don't work as a hyperlink, let me know and I'm happy to send them along. And then these are some additional resources that I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Aarin. Let's take about 7 minutes or so for questions. There's an administrative question regarding transcripts being available to download. We're looking into that. We'll get back to you. Let me see if there are any questions from the chat. Someone said microaggression, yes, familiar. Yeah, sounds like our speakers brought everyone very nutritious food for thought. That is awesome. Right, someone said that a microaggression refers to an interaction between individuals on the micro level. It does not refer to the impact being small. I agree with that.
I think it looks like
And here's the question saying, how can we respond effectively to microaggressions? Would you like to answer that, Aarin?
Ooh, sure. So that's a tough one. I think that when I experience microaggressions, I sometimes even wonder, like, is it just me? Did they say this because of XYZ that might make me different from them? One thing that I've started to do, if someone says something that I think falls in the category of a microaggression to me, I'll at least kind of throw it back to them to say, like, I'm so surprised that you feel comfortable saying that to someone. Really to just encourage thought and maybe like have them put themselves in check, because it's a challenge to not be the aggressor when someone does something to you that makes you feel attacked. So I just try to use my genetic counseling skills to kind of put it back on them. It works for me.
Sounds good. Thank you for that recommendation. And there's another question. Can you give us some examples about how to start difficult conversations?
Oh, I wish. I think it's definitely easier said than done. I think even just positioning yourself to have the courage to say anything at all is tough. It was tough for me to even think that I'd be okay with putting this together and speaking to you all about it. So I'm probably not in the best position to give some good examples about how to start, but the desire is the first step. So if it's something that I see, it was Michelle's question, if you're motivated to kind of learn how to make and initiate those difficult conversations, educate yourself so that you know what you're talking about, and just be prepared to know that not everyone's going to agree with you. And I think in doing the research, feeling confident, then that will kind of position you to do your very best in those uncomfortable situations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And already answered. Yes, so another question for you, strategies for patient-initiated microaggression. That one is interesting.
That's tough. I have definitely, and I know that many of my colleagues have as well, been in a position where a patient interaction might have put you in a position to be the recipient of a microaggression, maybe a micro insult or a micro invalidation. I think that just going back to what you know, your skill set, and being confident in what you have to offer, and then just killing them with kindness, because our job is to really be present. And oftentimes, I don't correct patients when they make a comment that I feel might be offensive to me, just because I'm not ready for that courageous conversation. But I do think that we know that it happens, and my response has really just been to show them how much I do know and how I can be present for them, and just impress them that the Black girl that they didn't think would be able to was able to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, how do you suggest tackling internalized racism when facing microaggressions?
That's tough. I would love really to hear if there was anyone else who was listening in that might have something to add that can kind of help frame it, because I'm going to be very biased in my own responses. They're all going to be based on my personal experience, but I'd love to hear what other people have to say too.
If anyone has ideas, feel free to chat those. And next question, do you have any suggestions for advising GC intern students on these fantastic steps for courage in practice, aside from modeling these actions to them? For example, specific conversations to bring up.
From a student perspective, let me read the question, I'm sorry.
So let me read again. Do you have any suggestions for advising GC interns or students on these fantastic steps for courage in practice, aside from modeling these actions to them? So example would be specific conversations to bring up to the students or interns.
Yeah, I think that vulnerability on behalf of a student in a place where they are still learning, and the genetic counselors and their supervisors and staff members really have that power, it's going to be a challenge to even expect a student in their role to be able to step up and do that for themselves. So I think that they really need advocates who support safe spaces for them, who are able to identify that these things are happening and to support them through the process. Because I couldn't imagine, I know firsthand as a student, there wasn't anything that I felt like I could say when I was experiencing those things in the moment. I think from a standpoint of program directors and staff and mentors and other genetic counselors working in the field, it's really our job to kind of help support students who are learning to navigate how to be genetic counselors, but also all of the other things that are going to be thrown their way as they're working through this professional journey, kind of with the dynamic that we have right now. So I would kind of say that it would be a group effort if a student intern was really looking for ways to start that courageous conversation. They need backup.
That's a great idea. So we have one last question that we can get to. So for the rest, please directly chat Aarin or Christina with your question. And the last question is, as you've explored DEI in GC, what have been your favorite or most informative resources?
I think, here, I'll show you, because because I'm still sharing my slides, right? I think my favorite would be the implicit association test. Harvard's implicit association test, I think, is really eye-opening. I think that everybody should take it. I think that if anybody's going to kind of start to figure out where they are, that would be the best place to begin. But the curated resources on the NSGC JEDI page are really helpful too. So those top two, that's what I would choose.
Thank you. And as a reminder, the slides are available to download if you want to look at that resource list again. And now we'll conclude this plenary.